Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back to my channel, Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer, with you guys today. And today's topic is relationships. I find this particular area of life actually to be most interesting, most fascinating, and the area of life that really challenges us the most for a number of different reasons. And in the world of astrology, when we're assessing a relationship through our own birth chart and through the potential partner or partner that we're wanting to understand better, there are certain key points that really require a very thorough analysis and understanding. Before I get to those, which there's about 10 points I'm going to briefly touch on today or point to, and I've just lost my track of thought there. Never mind, it'll come back to me. So these 10 points that I'm going to discuss today, first of all, this is not beginner's astrology, really. You need to have a pretty firm foundation or understanding of the entire zodiac, so the 12 zodiac signs, the houses, which draw up the actual astrological natal chart, the planets, the cosmic forces, what they represent archetypically, and the aspects between the planets as well. The aspects define the context of the relationship that one body is having to another. What are they sharing and exchanging between each other? What are the challenges? What are the growth points? What's stimulated? Things like that. The other thing that's important to understand with all of this is the cross of matter, which is the 4 angles of the birth chart. Those 4 angles of the birth chart, whether you're looking at a relationship chart, whether you're looking at a natal chart, whatever chart you're looking at, those 4 angles are, and I've said this before, they are the most potent points of the actual birth chart. And this is the reason why when we are working with predictive work in astrology, there are various techniques to use which are very, very advanced, and I do intend to teach them at some point, whether that will be introducing, I possibly will introduce them as part of my YouTube videos, but at some point I do intend to create a course online, which I've said before. That requires a lot of effort in putting things together in the form of how that would be accessible to you guys. I've got the material, it's just I probably need some assistance in how to create it on an online forum, etc. Anyway, that's another story. Those four angles of the birth chart, they are the most potent, and as I was about to say, in predictive work, you know, when you have a very important transit or progression or something else called a primary direction to any of those 4 angles, the 4 angles being the ascendant, the IC, the descendant, and the MC, those 4 points, hi Coco, those 4 points essentially create what I would consider to be evolutionary change. That doesn't mean that it's easy always. It can be extremely challenging, but it's almost always certainly life-changing. So this is important to understand, because when you're looking at a relationship astrology, one of the important components is do you have your partner's personal planets aspecting any of your angles and vice versa. I'll get into that in a minute, but let's just start with some real basics. Coco's just standing by on my books and paperwork. Okay, what I'll do for today is I'm going to bring up the chart of Prince, as in the singer, the artist. I'm a very, very devoted fan of him and his music, and the more I the more I understand of him, the more I love him, actually. But anyway, I will be using his chart just very, very simply. I don't want to go into things too deeply, but I do want to point to a couple of interesting factors in his chart from a relationship perspective. And it's also a way for us to have a reference point to be able to point to the various 10 points that I'm going to share with you guys today that I think are really crucial in understanding and analyzing when you're wanting to understand yourself in relationships and also your partner. So, as I said, you do really need to have a pretty, at least basic understanding of the things I said, which is the signs, the planets, the aspects, and the houses. So the main two houses that we would look to in the birth chart are the 5th and the 7th houses. Now, they are two very different houses in what they represent, but they both connect to love and relationships. Their connection or reflection of that component of life is seen very differently, though, through a very different lens in each of those houses. The 5th house is more around it's the house of procreation, so it's the house of creative juice. But in terms of love and love relationships and things like that, it's very much about love affairs. It's also very much the house where you can connect with somebody initially, and it might be that sort of exciting, playful, non-serious type of connection where there's a lot of playfulness, activity, sexually or otherwise. It's very light-hearted. It's a lot of fun. It brings a lot of joy. It's the classic love affair domain of the chart, which can lead to longer lasting commitments, but that is usually where it starts, in that 5th house archetypal energy. And the 7th house is more or less what we look for in another person, or what we look for in a partnership, in a relationship, what we think we need from another or a partnership. So it has a more serious undertone to it, and it is often referred to as the house of marriage. So we need to assess the 5th house. We need to look at what is in the 5th house, if anything at all. Are there any planets in the 5th house? They will describe the undertones of what the 5th house means for you and your partner. If there's nothing in the 5th house, and even if there is, you still need to look at the ruler of the 5th house. So say you had Mercury on the 5th house, Gemini on the 5th house cusp, you would then look to the ruler of that, which is Mercury, and Mercury could be ruling that house and could be in the 5th house. But if it's not in the 5th house, where is it located in the chart? That's going to be a very key part of your analysis and building the story of how this 5th house plays out for you or for your partner. The same principle applies to the 7th house. We need to look at the condition of the 7th house. What is in the 7th house, if anything at all? Whatever planets are in there are going to color and shape what the person projects in the world of relationships, what they are attracted to, what repels them as well, for that matter, and what they are looking for. So a very simple example, if you had Mercury in the 7th house, then you're really looking for a partnership where communication is absolutely key and primary to the relationship feeling fulfilling for you. So likely to attract a partner who's very chatty, very communicative, very articulate, very intelligent, and could be very tricky as well. Remember, Mercury was the trickster. Then you would look at the sign on the 7th house cusp, and you would look to the ruler. What is the ruler of the 7th house? Is it in the 7th house? If it's not, where is it located in the birth chart? That's going to add another foundation, another layer of how that 7th house gets activated and what area of life does it get activated in. Now, a very interesting, actually, before I go there, so you're assessing the 5th house, the ruler on the cusp, planets in the 5th house. The 7th house, the sign on the 7th house, planets in the 7th house, the ruler of the 7th house. Then you would add another layer which starts to get more in depth, but it is important. First of all, the location of Venus, the location of Mars, the location of the Sun, the location of the Moon. They are the 4 planets that connect to relationships, partnerships, marriage, the feminine and the masculine in the different forms through the Sun, Moon, Mars, Venus. So you would need to assess where they are. Then you would need to assess what are the aspects between these planets, between Mars and Venus. Does Mars and Venus have an aspect in your chart? Does it have an aspect in your partner's chart? The luminaries, the Sun and Moon, do the Sun and Moon have an aspect in your chart, in your partner's chart? If these planets do have aspects, what is the nature of these aspects? Are they soft or hard aspects? Are they squares, conjunctions, trines, oppositions, sextiles, inconjunct? You know, there's a lot of different aspects that describe very different attributes in terms of how these planets are relating to each other, if at all. Another level you can add to that would be assessing the 12th house. Now, the 12th house is in, very basic traditional astrology. It's not necessarily normally associated with relationships, but according to evolutionary astrology, it is. And I have an eclectic approach to astrology, so I use different lenses to view things from. One thing I've learned throughout my astrological journey is that never limit yourself with just one way of looking at things, because I don't know if you guys can see that, but Coco's just pressed something on my screen and we just need to get rid of it. There we go. The chart is multidimensional, as you are multidimensional, as we live in a multidimensional, cosmic universe. Nothing is looked through one stream and one stream only. There is place and space for various ways of looking at things and using different principles and different analytical approaches and skills to understanding things. Much of that is always pertained to your own level of consciousness and evolution and what you're ready to actually explore and look at anyway. The other thing to really pay attention to is the sign of Mars and the sign of Venus and what those signs describe from an evolutionary perspective. If you look into evolutionary astrology, everything is viewed from the perspective of evolving. So whatever sign Mars is in, whatever sign Venus is in, your evolutionary process through that Mars energy is seen through whatever sign that is for you. The same goes with Venus. Then you can also add, I'm probably going to add 20 points by the time this finishes. Then it's also important to pay attention to the polarity point of Mars and Venus, just as we look at the polarity point to Pluto, Pluto being the soul of the chart. So the polarity point is the opposite sign that is opposite to your Venus or opposite to your Mars. That holds a bunch of information for you as well. Another thing to be paying attention to is you can add a couple of other dimensions here. One is from ancient astrology, and it's something called Arabic parts. Now, these parts are made up of calculating certain points in the chart. For example, ascendant plus moon equals da-da-da. Sun plus moon minus ascendant equals blah, blah, blah. You don't need to worry about the technical process of this, because if you have astrological software, it just works it out for you anyway. But it is interesting to understand the basic premise of how these Arabic parts how are they derived. Now, within Arabic parts, there's a part called the part of marriage. So you can assess the part of marriage if you're wanting to understand another level of the importance of marriage or a strong commitment, let's say, in the relationship of an individual or of yourself. Now, the Arabic part, will be significant, but it'll be mostly significant when it's forming aspects to the relationship planets in your chart, or when it's forming aspects or is in the houses that represent the relationships. So if it's in the 7th house, it takes, a lot of priority. If it's in the 5th house, it's also primary. If it's in the 12th house, I would consider that very important too. And speaking of the 12th, I just want to go back to that because I started and I didn't finish. The 12th house is the component that describes within our psyche the idealistic view, perception, desires that we have of the ideal partner in our life. So whatever is going on in the 12th house and the sign on the 12th house cusp does reflect very strongly the god or goddess figure that we project onto normal people, which is why it is very difficult for a person to live up to that god goddess projection that we put on them. That's why the 12th house is very complex, but you do pay attention to the 12th house as well. The other thing that is really, really crucial is the 4 angles of the birth chart are what they represent: yourself, your relationships, your home life, and your career, work life, vocation, life path. So they are the primary components to who you are, to how you express yourself in this life, what creates meaning for you, how you relate and share, what are you striving to achieve, what sort of successes are you aiming for, what are you trying to cultivate and evolve through from a professional perspective as well. So when your partner's personal planets particularly, if they are conjunct any of your 4 angles, that's going to mean something very, very important for you. So your angles being hit off by your partner's personal planets, those angles, meaning those parts of your life, are triggered and activated by your partner's planets. So it is you that is experiencing that energy more than your partner. On the other hand, in the reverse, if your personal planets, and when I say personal, I'm really speaking of the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, right? Any of those planets hitting off your partner's angles, then your partner is going to experience your personal planetary energies affecting his or her life, those 4 angles, those 4 areas of life: self, relationships, home life, career, life path. So there's quite a few points I've covered there. Another thing that I also look to, and I do this in natal readings anyway, from a esoteric perspective, esoteric astrological perspective, I look at the soul ray and personality ray of the individual. This can be quite telling in the realm of relationships as well, particularly if an individual, such as yourself or your partner, comes out with a number 4 or a number 6 for their soul or personality ray. Number 4, because number 4 is very much connected to relationships. It's connected to a number of different things, but one primary component of the archetypal expression of ray number 4, it is about relationships. And it's the term, or the key phrase for number 4, is harmony through conflict. So what I've seen in a lot of people's charts is when they have either a soul or personality ray number 4, they experience a lot of conflict in the realm of relationships. Number 6 is very powerful and important in relationships as well, because it describes a person who is very, very devoted and very, very idealistic in their relationships. So there can be, a lot of disillusionment or a lot of misguided devotional energy. All right, so that's another level you can add. I think I've covered the main sort of points. Just one other thing that I feel is very important to keep in mind. I hope you've noted all this down, because you will need to note it down to remember it, I think, especially if you're new to relationship astrology at least. what was the other point? Yes. So another very interesting thing, and this comes really through Synastry, which is in astrological relationship readings, the two primary methods that I use are Synastry charts and composite charts. They are very, very powerful and can show very different things, which can leave you scratching your head at times because you're thinking, well, in the composite chart, you know, this part of the chart shows this wonderful, wonderful feature of the union between the two people. But yet in the synastry, there's extreme conflict with very similar planetary energies. So it's, you know, it's a case of weighing things up. You can't just, it's very difficult to just make one definitive sort of answer or response to things because things are multi-layered, as I said earlier. So there's a lot going on, as you can see. And it is very challenging to synthesize all this material and get an accurate, you know, sort of picture. It takes years of experience, and I'm still learning myself, even though I've been doing this for many years. And I will continue to learn until my last breath, as I feel each of us will. The other thing when it comes to synastry, there's a lot of things about synastry, but one main thing I want to point your attention to is if any of your personal planets fall in your partner's 12th house, his or hers 12th house, the 12th house of the birth chart, that's very, very telling of very specific things about their relationship, a lot of which is always connected to being secretive, in denial, disillusioned, confusion, unable to really see the person for who they actually are. And vice versa, if your planets are in your partner's 12th house, they will have that experience of you, as it were. So it's very, very difficult when your Sun, Moon, Mercury, Mars, or Venus falls in your partner's 12th house, or those planets fall in your 12th house. That's a very, very challenging synastry layout to work through. It takes a lot of devotion and dedication, which is very much about the 12th house as well, to make those energies conscious in the relationship with each other, because it can create a lot of confusion, assumptions, misunderstandings, a lot of denial. There's a lot of unconscious energies playing out, which often evolve into identifying something in your partner down the track in the relationship, and sort of standing there thinking, that's not something I really ever saw in you. Where did this come from? Well, where it's come from is the 12th house. Remember, anything in the 12th house is hidden and is unconscious and is played out in unconscious ways. So it's very difficult to understand from a conscious perspective, and to understand from a perspective of being transparent and clear, direct. It's not. It's murky. It's there's no boundaries in the 12th house. Everything's kind of blending into one, as it were. So when you're talking about personal planets being in the 12th house, the personal planets very much have to do with ego, okay? Ego has nothing to do with the 12th house. The 12th house is where we surrender our ego and we let go. So when you have a planet like Mars, the Moon, the Sun, Venus or Mars, even Mercury, even though Mercury is not necessarily an ego planet as such, but it is a personal planet connected to the ego of our left brain, which enables us to communicate our thoughts, ideas, etc., which does connect to our ego. So those planets can be very challenged in the 12th house, whether you have them there natally as well, naturally, or whether they fall in your partner's 12th house. There can be a real sense of not knowing components of one another, feeling that one person is being really private or really secretive about a lot of things in their life, it's very difficult to get to know them. All right. There's this sense of not really knowing your partner. And it's not like that person is doing it deliberately. They are not. Usually they are not. Usually it's very unconscious behavior. So if I can just share my screen and just pull up Prince's chart. So what I actually did was I looked at Prince's chart, and I looked at the chart of the woman that he was married to. Her name is I can't pronounce it. I think Meta Garcia. Anyway, he was married to her for 4 years, and she really was the love of his life. And there was a great age gap between them, which is interesting because she has Venus in Capricorn. When somebody has Venus in Capricorn, it is very typical that they will, have a relationship, at least one, with a person that's much older or much younger than themselves. In this case, Prince was significantly older than Meta. So this is Prince's chart. Now, I just want to point to some of the key components that I suggested you would need to look at when you're looking at relationship astrology. So here's Prince's 5th house. Now, he has Mars in that house. So Mars is in Aries. So there's a lot of energy and drive and juice when it comes to his creativity. Now, Prince was a very, very private person, as most of you would be aware, at least those of you who follow him or understand who he was and so forth. And we can see that because he's got Scorpio rising, Moon in Pisces, in the 4th house, Sun in the 8th house. Now, Sun in Gemini is not normally a person who's private necessarily, but they can be a person who lives a double life. Not saying that Prince did, by the way, but having his luminaries in these 2 water houses, the Scorpio house and the Pisces Cancerian house, these are the luminaries that give off that real private component to who he really was in his private life, in his private world. So you would pay very close attention to where those luminaries are if you were looking at somebody's chart and this is what it looked like, because that will tell you a lot about how they operate in the world of relationships, that their own feminine, inner masculine energies and forces, and how that plays out in their relationships and their life. So the 5th house is ruled by Jupiter in Prince's chart, and Jupiter is up here in the 12th. So even though the 5th house represents his own creative ability and talent and craft, which he was, he was beyond a lot of people. He was a genius, really. We saw that Mars in Aries, that creative force, that creative energy, but the Jupiter ruling his 5th house would imply that, if he was having an affair with somebody, some kind of love affair, I'm not speaking of an affair of, having an affair with somebody else's partner or something like that, although it could be that because the 5th house is about those sorts of experiences. But if he was having some kind of fling or love affair, we wouldn't know about it because the planet that rules that house is in the 12th house. Now, I'm looking at the traditional ruler to Pisces, which is Jupiter. We can also look at the modern ruler, which is Neptune, and I always do look at the traditional and the modern rulers of the signs. So in this case, we have Jupiter and Neptune both in the 12th. Now, both those planets rule his 5th house. So there's a hidden component to his love life, right? And we see that because Jupiter and Neptune are in the 12th house. So that's very, very clear. We also see that the Sun in the 8th and the Moon in the 4th add that dimension where his inner private world, sexual life, home life were very, very private and sacred to him as well, and indeed they were. Now, if we look at the 7th house, this is a little bit more open in the sense where he has Mercury in the 7th house, and he has Taurus on the 7th house cusp. So we pay attention to Mercury in the 7th. That would imply that whatever partnership or partnerships he had or engaged in, they would require a lot of communication, a lot of intelligent, witty, clever conversations and sharing. Very primary to his one-on-one connections. Now, I don't know much about in that level, in terms of his ex-wife, whether she was particularly communicative or not. What I do know about her is that she was a dancer, and that's how he found her. He saw her belly dancing, and he was in awe of her, basically. Now, the Venus in Taurus describes her. She was very, very beautiful, and she was a dancer, and Venus rules dance. So that Venus is in his 6th house, but because it's around about 7 degrees away from the 7th house cusp, in this case, we could say that Venus actually influences his 6th house and his 7th house. That's what I would be looking at. So in the Venus in the 6th house really is his artistry again, and just his technical skills and his constant improvement on himself with his skills and his craft and his talent. I mean, he played, 6 or 7 or 8 instruments, How many people do you know can do that? I can't even play one. I wish I could. I love the guitar, and I really would love to play the guitar. So we start to get a picture here of, how the 7th house, what it sort of showed for him in terms of what did he look for in a partner. He looked for somebody who was very intelligent, for one, somebody who was very beautiful, symbolized by the Taurus, Venus in Taurus. He wasn't going to be with somebody who wasn't beautiful. We're talking about the aesthetic value and beauty of a human being. There's an inner, level of that as well, which is described by Venus as well. Venus describes our inner worth and our outer sense of worth. So it has a couple of dimensions to it. But I think the Venus in Taurus and the Taurus on the descendant really describes that woman that he married. And as I said, they were very, very private, about their life together. And the very sad thing is, and what ended their marriage, was that they experienced being pregnant twice and losing both those babies. Now, that the grieving and the pain and the suffering that was born out of those tragic losses that they experienced together was too much for them to cope and handle. So it ultimately just ended the marriage, which they were both so heartbroken about. They just couldn't cope with the pain. It was so severe, so severe. And, we can look a little bit further and say, hey, well, Ceres is in Leo, and I just can't quite see here because... okay, I'm just going to stop sharing the screen just for a moment. Okay. Okay. No, I just wanted to check something out before I made a comment about that. So just share my screen again, go back to the chart. Anyway, Ceres in Leo can be a loss of children, by the way. And because Leo is the sign of children, and there you go, Prince had Ceres in Leo. So anyway, that's just another dimension. The first baby that they had was actually physically born and died within a week. And it died with a very severe and unusual malfunction or deformity to the skull of the brain. And I mean, imagine having a baby, you know, for a week and thinking everything's fine and normal, and then it dies a week later, and you find out that it had this condition that was just, it was so unusual. There was nothing that could have been done about it, at least at that time. I kind of find that interesting with Prince having Mars in Aries in the fifth, because the fifth house is the house of children, and Aries is the head, and Mars can be death as well. Anyway, that's another level. You know, you'd need to look at a lot more and unpack a lot more about that, but that, I just find that very interesting. Usually people who have Mars in Aries, it's not uncommon for them to have injuries to the head, accidents to their head, and die as a result of it as well. Now, I know in this case it was his child. The fifth house is his house of children, right, as well as his love affairs. The other final thing that I want to point to with this chart, without really analyzing things too much further, I couldn't get a time of birth for his wife. So we can look at some synastry things, and there are some pretty striking synastry points in this chart, and I'm just going to point to what they are. So, okay, this is Prince's chart is the inner wheel, and the bi-wheel, secondary wheel around it, is his ex-wife's planets in relation to his chart, right? So this is one way of looking at synastry, and it can be very confusing if you're not familiar with looking at synastry, but don't worry about that for now. Just pay attention to what I'm going to point to. So what have we here? Okay, so she was a Scorpio, and you can see here that this is her sun in Scorpio, which forms a conjunction to his ascendant. So bang, we immediately have a very strong point of connection there. You could say between her soul, the ascendant is the soul, and his primary, you know, solar expression, his personality, who he was, who she was rather, because that's his ascendant and that's her sun. So his soul and her sun, you know, there's a, when you get one of the luminaries on another person's angle, it's a very, very powerful connection. So he felt her sun in Scorpio very, very much. That's one point. Another point is his Mars is conjunct her south node. Now, they are in different signs, but the conjunction is still there, because it is only going to take about another 4.5 degrees, 3.5 degrees before Mars gets into Taurus. 0 degrees of Taurus, therefore it will be right on the south node. So that's within orb, all right? So we can say his Mars is conjunct to her south node. So there's some connection there from the past, which has got to do with some kind of violent death, accident of some sort. And it's interesting that it repeats in this life, but with their child. Head injury, Aries, Mars. The other thing is that her moon is conjunct his sun. Now, I don't have a time of birth for her, so there's a question mark around that. But I would expect that it would be, her moon would be conjunct his sun. That's an instant union of the feminine and masculine between them. It's a sign of marriage as well, which they did get married. So there's another hit there. Her Juno in Sagittarius is conjunct his Saturn. So that pretty much describes a serious marriage, partnership, which it was. It was the most serious relationship he ever had and she ever had. She actually hadn't even had a relationship before him. She was a virgin when she met him. This is how serious it was for her. So there's another connection we make there. His vertex at 25 degrees of Gemini, the vertex is the VX up here in the 8th house, is conjunct her moon. It's a very important connection there again. And finally, just in terms of synastry, and I just want to leave Prince's chart here for now, but I want to explain something first before I do. I was just reading, and either I had forgotten this or wasn't aware of it altogether. I'm not entirely sure. But I was just reading something as I was gathering some information for this video. And what I read was that, and I knew Prince and his wife went on Oprah's show not long after the baby was born. And I actually recall seeing that show. It was such a long time ago, so I vaguely remember it, but I'm sure it's floating out there on YouTube somewhere. So they went on Oprah and they lied. They told the world and Oprah that their baby was alive when in fact their baby had died. And I'm not here to make a judgment, because who am I to make a judgment on that? But what I read is that part of the reason they did that is because they just simply couldn't cope with even verbalizing and acknowledging and admitting what had happened. So it's very complex anyway. It's very complicated why they did it, but that was mentioned as part of the notes in something I was reading. The reason I'm bringing that up is because of this. Now, this is Prince's 12th house, right? In this inner wheel, this is his 12th house. So these are, how do we say her name? Matea's planets that fall in Prince's 12th house. Remember what I said about planets falling in the 12th house. It's pretty important. Now, the main one here, forget about these other points here. That's part of fortune, that's Vulcan. Forget about those for now, right? And just look at the Mercury. Her Mercury falls in his 12th house. Okay, that's very, very important, because that immediately tells us that there's secrecy, denial, disillusionment with their own thoughts and communications, right? Now, if you look to his Mercury is actually opposite her Neptune. So it's the same signature, same energy repeated in both their charts from a synastry perspective. And Mercury-Neptune is always about lying. It's about being deceptive. Yes, it's rich imagination, sensitivity, confusion, artistic, poetic with words, and, you know, it's all those things. But on a very plain, simple, lower form expression, reflection, Mercury-Neptune aspects are always indicative of someone who certainly has enormous capability of intentionally lying. And this is what both of them did about something that was clearly very, very private and extremely painful to the both of them. But anyway, I just find that point really, really interesting, how their Mercuries are connected to each other's Neptunes, and her Mercury is in his 12th house. The 12th house is always, as I said, about secrets. It can be lies, illusions, denial, unconscious stuff, confusion, idealism, you know, it's all that together. Now, I'll leave Prince's chart there and her chart. I think I've sort of pointed to everything I wanted to point to. The other thing about planets in the 12th house, when they are in your own natal 12th house, and this can play out in synastry as well if your planets are in your partner's 12th house. See, the 12th house is so vast, it has so many layers and levels, but it's also referred to as the house of the house of undoing. It's where we come undone. So when there's personal planets in the 12th house, there's a very strong, the ego forces are incredibly threatened because they're trying so hard to feel like they are in control, feel like they understand themselves, their purpose, and so forth. But they feel incredibly undermined when they're floating around in the 12th house. There's no anchor. And ego planets need to have that foundation, anchor, stability, clarity, purpose, vision, and so forth. The house of undoing can also be connected to when we have those personal planets in the 12th house and we're not acting authentically and we're acting dishonestly. This is how we come undone. The 12th house has a way of undoing what we're trying to do when we're not being authentic and honest and transparent. So, in other words, if you're a bullshit artist, if you're deliberately trying to deceive people, playing people and things like that, when you've got personal planets in the 12th house, it'll fall back on you. It'll fall back pretty hard. If your personal planets are in your partner's 12th house, your partner may feel that about you in some kind of way. They're not sure where you're coming from. They're not sure what angle they can't get an angle of you. They're not really sure who you actually are. It's a very, very, very complex energy when you have planets in the 12th house, whether it's natally or whether it's through synastry, certainly through a composite chart as well. So just to recap, as you can see, I've pointed out to about 10 different things which would require a lot of in-depth analysis and understanding to draw a picture out of this. And I think the other very important thing, extremely important thing, is that these are principles and key points and guidelines, but the delineation, the interpretation, the reflection of how this shows up in each individual is going to be very unique, simply because every individual, every soul is evolving at a different level. No one's having the same experiences, really. Like I've said before, we all have Venus in our chart, we all have Mars in our chart, we have all the planets in our chart, all of us. We're all born into a particular sun sign, Mercury in a particular sign, etc. But the way that shows up, the way that rolls out there, the way it gets projected, the way it gets experienced, the way it is assimilated, the way one is evolving through that, the way one understands and is learning and growing is very, very unique for every single person. So these points that I made today are very powerful guidelines to help you create a structure, form around how to start unpacking the world of relationships through the lens of astrology. But you mustn't make assumptions that it is the same for every single individual, because it's not. This is where, because I'm a therapist as well, I work also from a platform of asking questions to clients, people I do readings for. It depends on the individual. Some people just want to hear, what they want to hear. Or let me put that another way. Some people are just interested in hearing in my interpretation, period, and they're not necessarily interested in divulging or engaging or connecting. That's not that many people. Most people I work with, I find, are fairly open and transparent and honest with me, which is wonderful, because that enables me to understand their chart from a level that's not just from my own understanding, teachings or wisdom or whatever, but from their personal feel, from their personal view and experience. And that's important to integrate when you're actually working with people, when you're wanting to understand somebody's life. So guys, 5th house, ruler, planets in there. Seventh house, ruler, planets in there. Locate the ruler of the fifth and the seventh if they are not in those houses. Because wherever that ruler is, it's going to show you how the fifth or the seventh house is playing out. Where is it triggered and activated? I'll give you another example just to kind of give you a little bit more to go with. Say you had Taurus on the seventh house cusp, just like Prince did. And Venus is the ruler, but Venus just happened to be in your 10th house or in your partner's 10th house. Well, that's going to show you that this person's experience of relationships, what they are seeking in a partner, in partnership, what they're seeking to experience, what their needs are and so forth, connects to their career, connects to their career path. It could be that they end up working with their partner together. It could be that their partner really helps them in their career path to really evolve or to flourish or to grow. There's a lot of other things I could say to that, but that's just to give you a little glimpse, you know. So the ruler of the seventh house, its location is going to tell you wherever it is, how it's activating and how it's integrating and through what it's integrating with the seventh house. It's really important to understand that, and the same principle applies to the fifth house. So you've got the houses, you've got the planets, you've got the rulers, you've got Mars and Venus, looking at them individually in the sign that they are in from an evolutionary perspective. If you've got Venus in Aries, what are you here to work through? What's your evolutionary path? A lot of it has to do, on a downside, it can be you can be completely narcissistic, selfish, self-centered. On the other hand, once you start to grow and understand that Venus in Aries, it's about independence and freedom, asserting yourself, needing to be independent in relationships, needing a space, you know, needing excitement. That could be because in a previous life you might have been in relationships where you gave too much of yourself. It was all about the other person. So this lifetime you need to learn how to stand on your own, you know, exert your own power, your own independence, find out who you are intrinsically within your own self. You know, your own self-worth and value has to come from within you as opposed to the partnership. You know, it's very complex, but that's just to give you an example. And Mars, very similar thing. You know, you need to look at Mars. What is Mars in Gemini? How is that evolving? You know, what does that mean for you? Or Mars in Sag, or Mars in Scorpio? What is the evolutionary intention with Mars in Scorpio or with Venus in Aries? It's important to understand that as a baseline so that you know what it is you're here to evolve through these personal planets. As I said, look at the soul ray and personality ray if you know how to work with that level of astrology. That can tell you so much. It can feed so much into the realm of relationships. And as I said, particularly rays 6 and 4, if they show up for a person, pay very close attention to those rays in the person's life regarding relationships. The part of marriage, as seen through the Arabic parts, which Solar Fire has, not sure that astro.com has. It possibly may have it. Other programs would have it as well. If you don't have access to it, don't worry about it so much. It's not a primary thing, but it is an additional thing that you can later apply to your work of relationships in astrology. And planets on the angles of your chart, your partner's planets on your angles, or your planets on your partner's angles. Or one thing I think I forgot to mention earlier, I'm not sure if I did, so just in case I didn't, the rulers to your angles making aspects to your partner's angles and vice versa. Let me just say that again. The rulers to the 4 angles in your birth chart making connections to the angles of your partner's chart, and or the rulers of the angles of your chart making connections to your partner's personal planets and vice versa. These are very important things to note and notice because they show you the fundamental connection between the two people. And when there are all these dots being joined together, it's just building and building and building a story around the relationship and the fact that this relationship is meaningful. Now, how this relationship is going to manifest and what are the challenges going to be is going to be determined on assessing all these different things that I pointed to. And the final thing that I'd like to leave you guys with is this. When you see a lot of connections between two people, astrologically speaking, through synastry and through the composite chart, it is showing you that this relationship is meaningful. Whether it's, completely uplifting and positive and shining all the time and, is going to last 20 years or 30 years is not the point. But when there are all these connections between you and another person and a relationship is formed, it is usually because this relationship holds great meaning for the both of you because there is great potential for change and the necessity for change and growth for both of you. But it can only take place when the two of you are in a relationship. When you're not in a relationship, then the astrology means nothing between you and that other person. It's only when the two of you come together and form this bond or connection that things get triggered in one another, right? Through the charts, natal charts, synastry, composite charts, etc. Okay, guys, I'll leave it here for today, and I hope you find these points useful for relationship astrology. Feel free to contact me if you want to have a relationship chart reading. They are pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing to have that done if you're in a relationship at the moment, or you're about to get into a relationship, or whatever the case. There's all sorts of relationships too. The majority of the points that I pointed to today really, really reflect intimate, personal relationships. Whether that's gay, heterosexual, queer, whatever, transgender, those relationships that are defined by the different identity that somebody has are a personal relationship, right? So I don't want to exclude anybody, from this world based on how they identify, right? I've got gay and lesbian friends, I've got queer friends, I've got straight friends, I've got all sorts of friends. So I'm very, very aware that we need to be respectful, to all people, regardless of how they identify. But the point being is that these principles today were spoken or speaking to the world of love relationships. You can apply most of these principles to relationships between you and your boss, you and your mother, you and your son, you and your daughter, you and your brother, you and your best mate, etc. Okay, guys, as I said, feel free to contact me and book a reading if you want to have a relationship reading or any other reading for that matter. There's lots of different readings I do. If you have any questions, just email me. I'm happy to get back to you. And see you guys very soon with another video. Much love and blessings. Bye for now.